Okay. Okay. So, good morning, Professor Agnes. Yeah. So, good morning and good afternoon, colleagues and friends. It's our great honor to invite Professor Agnes to deliver a talk in the field of mobile learning. Yeah. So, let me first introduce Professor Agnes Kukuska-Hilmer for you. Professor Agnes is a professor of learning, technology, and communication in the Institute of Education Technology at the Open University, UK, and past president of the International Association of Mobile Learning. She leads the Learning Futures Research and Innovation Program and the Innovating Pedagogy annual reports. Her work encompasses distance education, mobile learning, language learning, and education for migrants and refugees. In addition to well over 200 academic publications, she has authored policy and practice reports for UNESCO, British Council, Commonwealth of Learning, International Research Foundation for English Language Education, and Cambridge University Press. Professor Kukuska-Hilmer is on the editorial boards of several journals, including the International Journal of Mobile and Blended Learning. She is currently working on projects exploring access to mobile technologies and the role of English in the UK and in several countries in Africa and in Asia. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Agnes. Yeah. So our session, so Professor Agnes, can we start? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides now.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to share my ideas with you today. As has been mentioned, I've been working in the field of mobile learning for a long time. And the field itself actually is now over 20 years old. So it's quite a good time, I think, to reflect on how we're doing as a field and where we're going. And that's why for this talk, I decided to talk about shaping the future of mobile learning. I think it will have multiple futures rather than one future. But at the same time, I'm interested in what we may all have in common as we conduct this research in different parts of the world, and whether we have some common aims as we have got to a point where we understand mobile learning as a field much better. So that's the general theme. I'm also going to take the opportunity to reflect a little bit on my own work in this field and some of the key themes that have interested me and that have motivated me to pursue the research in this field for such a long time now. Now, it's very pertinent that I work at the Open University. The work that I do is very much in the spirit of openness that is so key to everything that we do in our university. We have now a new campaign saying that the future is open. It's yours for the taking when you study with the experts in distance learning, and throwing education wide open. And I think these are important messages. The research I've been doing has been inspired by the Open University's social justice mission. And it's now very long history, over 50 years of high quality online teaching and supported learning. And that learning is available to all in higher education and at all stages of life. So not just when people are starting out, but at various times in their lives when they need to upskill or they need to refresh their knowledge. So I mention this because it, as I said, it very much informs my work, and I feel like it reflects my values as well. So today we're going to be talking, first of all, about some broad trends and innovations in teaching and learning, as in my role as the program lead for the Learning Futures program. I spend a lot of my time thinking about these broad trends and innovations, and I see mobile learning within that broader perspective. So then we will, after that, move into some more detailed consideration of mobile learning, particularly mobile language learning. That's been my field of interest, and what sort of research agendas and futures we are shaping through the work that we do, through the research that we do, and how much agency we can exercise in terms of where we want things to go. So a couple of questions for reflection for you on this slide as well. What kinds of mobile learning futures are being shaped by current research and practice? And what kinds of futures would you value or want to see? I think even if we are just pursuing research within our own classroom, within our own institution or school, nevertheless, we are contributing to a bigger picture of where mobile learning is going, what kind of evidence is being generated. But beyond that, also just which direction we're taking the field into, and how, what our sort of our bigger aims are, or what we hope will be achieved in education through the work that we do. So first of all, I'm going to say a little bit about the Learning Futures program, and particularly the Innovating Pedagogy series of reports that we publish. So the Learning Futures program has been running for some years now, and our current focus is on tackling global challenges in education. Those are, for example, challenges around greater access to education, which mobile technologies can enable. They don't always do that, but they can do it. Also issues around engagement, so students' engagement in their learning, and lifelong learning perspectives. And so we're exploring through various projects, future ways of teaching, learning, and assessing. We have many projects, so these are just kind of a few highlights here. A lot of work that we do is in citizen science. And here, the important aspect is involving people who are not in formal education in conducting science inquiries. We do a lot of work on the large or massive open online courses, and more recently micro-credentials. And lots of work in mobile learning, particularly now on research, intelligent assistants and chatbots, and how to support mobile populations. And that includes those who are forcibly displaced or who have moved for various reasons. So they are perhaps migrants or refugees, and they need to learn languages quickly within the context in which they are living and working. So that's our program. And one of the key activities in this program is our annual report on trends in teaching, learning, and assessment. We've now done them for 10 years. So it's a bit of a milestone for us to be thinking about what we've achieved with this series. It's a series that's led by currently, myself with colleagues in the Institute of Educational Technology, but it's also co-authored with external partners since 2015. And these are the two latest reports. the latest one, 2022, is just about to be published. So it will actually be on Thursday this week. So I'm not actually at liberty to talk about it now. I have to wait till Thursday. However, I will be talking about the big themes from all the reports. And of course, the link is there for you to download the latest report when it is published later this week. And I'll be very interested, of course, in your feedback and what value you feel you get out of that report. So, as I mentioned, we've been doing them now since 2015 with external partners. We've partnered with colleagues at various institutes or centers of innovation in the USA, Singapore, Israel, Norway, Ireland, China, and the latest one was done with colleagues at the Open University of Catalonia in Spain. So a fair selection of different countries that we've collaborated with, and I think, looking to the future, we will want to continue these partnerships. We have learned a lot from them mutually, I think. And so what's important to note here is that the trends, the innovations are to an extent being shaped by the people who take part in this activity and their particular perspectives, their interests, what they feel is current, important, and so on. If you haven't seen our reports before, this is just a quick overview of the one from 2021. And as you can see there on the slide, the 10 pedagogical innovations that we covered in this report are listed. And under each one, there's a very short phrase which summarizes the gist of that particular approach. So, for example, with the first one, best learning moments, this concerns positive mental states that learners enter into that support enjoyable and effective learning. And for example, best learning moments is very relevant to mobile learning as people are able to capture their experiences on the go, reflect on in what circumstances they learned best, or moments that they consider to be of particular value to them in their learning experience. So that's just one example. And I think mobile learning is certainly applicable to most of these approaches. And as you can see, last year we also covered using chatbots in learning, which is one of the growing areas of research, and also student co-created teaching and learning is perhaps another that I would like to highlight, but I'll come back to some of these ideas later. So that was our report last year. And because we've been doing them for 10 years, I took the opportunity with colleagues to reflect back on our 10 years of pedagogical innovation. And having done that, we arrived at 10 overarching themes that seem to emerge from the nearly 100 innovations that we've covered over the past 10 years. So in this table, you can see them listed on the left-hand side, and on the right, some examples from each of these themes. So examples of specific pedagogical innovations. For example, with connecting with others, we have collaboration or crowd learning, and so on. And I wonder whether these themes are also ones that you are very familiar with and working within, or whether some of them are perhaps new to you. I guess it's different for every researcher. Connecting with others is what we do through new technologies in a big way. So I suppose everybody would recognize and appreciate that theme. But perhaps some of the others are not so much the focus of current research. I think emotions in particular are not sort of generally recognized in research studies in mobile learning, although they're not neglected by any means, but they are not like a major focus. And also justice or social justice tends to be an aspect that some organizations promote, of course, global organizations like UNESCO. But on a more local level, it may not be a major theme for you, for example, as researchers. So I think it's worth kind of reflecting on these themes and thinking about whether the research that we do relates to some of these themes, and which ones, and whether there are others that we are focusing on. Again, thinking about mobile learning particularly, number 5 in this list relates to new settings for learning. That's always been a key aspect of mobile learning, taking learning out of the classroom, relating it to the places in which it happens. And of course, it's become extremely important during the pandemic, as people have learned from home, and we've discovered more about the home context as a place for learning, and that we didn't really have to think about so much before, because it wasn't of key interest to us. And I think that's really something very important for us now to consider. And more thought, I think, is going also into the frameworks to support thinking and learning. So with the adoption of new technologies, we realize that teachers need to change their teaching, but also learners need to be upskilled in terms of self-directing and self-regulating their learning, learning to learn, and understanding different metacognitive strategies that they can adopt. So I'm not going to go through each of these in detail. I think it's more a case of presenting them as a whole, and hopefully encouraging you to reflect on how they relate to your work. And I've been asked sometimes why we haven't covered mobile learning specifically within our lists of pedagogies. And my answer to that at the moment is that mobile learning has become such a vast field of activity, and there are so many different flavors and interpretations of it that it's not really possible to cover it on 2 or 3 pages as we do with some of these pedagogical approaches. So I wanted now to examine the field of mobile learning briefly here, despite the time constraints, just to really highlight some aspects of it, because I feel it is changing at a fast pace. And there, as I'm sure most of you know, there have been many definitions, but there has been an attempt to cohere around the definition that's presented here in the box. Learning across multiple contexts through social and content interactions using personal electronic devices. A definition from almost 10 years ago now that still is relevant. However, each of these elements has changed a lot, I think, in the past 10 years. So when we talk about multiple contexts, we used to constrain ourselves more or less to joining up activities at, say, at school and some outside location like a museum or a park. But now I think increasingly we need to be thinking about a broader range of contexts across educational contexts, work, leisure, daily life, community life, and also crucially learners creating their own context for learning. So for example, at home, and combining online and offline learning. So for example, in blended or hybrid ways. Then there's the whole aspect of social and content interactions, which again used to be more about the classmates interacting with each other and using set materials. Now we're talking increasingly about those interactions being with virtually anyone in the world, sharing and creating content, sometimes in an open way, not always. And last but not least, the personal aspect of mobile learning. In the past, there was a great emphasis on the devices being personal tools. So a lot of literature was about use of smartphones or tablets. But now we emphasize the fact that it's the learning that is personal, and how can it be made more personal? So that's some of the aspects to consider around how mobile learning is changing. And I've also taken the opportunity to look back at my own work in the field, where I started back in 2001. These are some of the studies that I've published, and really reflecting on what have been my key areas of interest. So I started looking at students' experiences of reading course materials on PDAs, and that's been an enduring interest for me. Students or learners more broadly, experiences. What can we learn by asking them about their experiences, understanding their experiences? Another key, I suppose, interest of mine has been in emergent practice, which is linked to learners' experiences, in the sense that I'm interested in what learners do in their own time, and how they are developing their practices, and how those practices can then inform formal education. So I'm interested in the interplay between informal and formal learning, often outside of class. And along the way, I've done quite a lot of work on skills development of various kinds, either generic learning skills. So for example, currently looking at self-regulation, or skills related to language learning specifically. And in my own case, I've been interested in using mobile technologies for listening, speaking, and oral assessment. So through these studies, I've addressed these themes, and currently I'm, if you go down to the bottom of the list, you can see that we're now looking at the experiences of marginalized school children in low resource settings, and I'll say more about that a little bit later in this talk. So these have been some of the research studies that I've done, but looking back actually over the past 20 years, what I noticed, and I was actually quite surprised, is how many big picture overviews I have published, looking at the totality of research going on in the field and looking at different aspects of it. So again, I think in the past, so if you look at the start of this list on the left-hand side, one of the first overviews I conducted with colleagues was about the use of tablets in schools. So it was an emphasis on the devices. And we were looking at, how effective they were in many schools across the UK. And over time, I've looked at aspects of evaluation, design, research, quite interested in learning cultures. So how what we do is influenced by the culture that we work within. Very interested in inclusive approaches, reskilling learners, personalization, teacher training, the idea of mobile pedagogy, and linguistic diversity, or multilingual approaches to mobile learning in recent years. And going down to the very bottom of that list, recent reflections on research questions that we are asking in the field. So looking back, I also noticed that my interest in the future was already apparent some years ago when I wrote about language learning now and in the future. And what I was saying at the time was we need to focus on developing a new mindset for mobile language learning, and that should be based around context, continuity, and openness to the unexpected, as there was research evidence at the time indicating that learners were using their mobile devices in unpredictable ways. So we needed to take that on board. Not everything could be designed. Some aspects of learning could be designed, but others would emerge as the learners were using the technologies in unpredictable environments. And I would still stand by the idea that these are very important themes. And then in 2016, with John Traxler, we compiled this book on the next generation of mobile learning, which had a strong focus on context, contextual learning, really elaborating notions of context and the new ecologies for learning that could be developed, learning in life, particularly health-related applications, how to mobilize learners to do research, for example, the new technologies that were emerging around augmented reality in relation to context, sustainable innovations, which is proving to be an important theme, and as mentioned just a minute ago, contexts in relation to cultures. If we can understand our cultures a bit better and make comparisons between them, then perhaps we can understand also why contextual learning may work better or differently in one context compared to another. So this is some of the top level work. Also more recently on connecting mobile learning with open and social learning, thinking about the fact that we've moved beyond just mobile learning to having to consider the integration of learning while mobile with access to and creation of learning resources in an open way, which both teachers and learners are doing, and the ability to take part in social interactions on the internet, which for many people has extended vastly their opportunities to learn and practice languages. But how do we integrate these aspects, I think, is still to be worked out and understood. But it's a case of understanding, the interactions between them and how open approaches change mobile learning, for instance, or how mobile learning changes social interactions and so on. So there's a lot to be explored here, I think, in going forth into the future. And also in a book I worked on with Valentina Morgana last year, we identified, in relation to mobile assisted language learning particularly, 5 big themes that were being presented by the researchers in this book, who were working with learners across educational contexts at different levels. So from, all the way from young children to adults of different ages, so different stages of education. And some very imaginative, creative uses of technology to support activities such as storytelling, reading, virtual exchange, and collaboration. And these 5 big themes emerged from this work, and I think it's important to take note of what up and coming researchers are talking about, I suppose, generally when they are describing these kinds of activities that they have developed and evaluated. So just briefly, I will go through these themes. I've presented this before, but each time I start with a different theme, because actually it's arguable which one is, let's say, the most important, but certainly they do interconnect with one another. So frequent interaction and reflection facilitated by mobile approaches is a big theme. People interacting with other people and with content outside of class. This enables more flexible collaboration and continuous reflection on their learning. And within the book, certain practices are suggested to support this, choosing, for example, familiar and comfortable means of communication, structuring the learning, and developing metacognitive skills. So that's one big theme from those case studies. Another one is about the vast range of technologies, methods, and modalities represented in the work. It's not just, let's say, smartphones or just tablets, but usually a mix of technologies used in different locations, in different ways, involving, text, speech, recordings, and so on. So access to services from any device, hopping between platforms and media for different tasks, and supporting teacher and learner preferences, which echoes the previous slide and the idea of sort of more comfortable learning environments. So responding to learner preferences regarding devices and media, and encouraging them to find, create, share, and annotate authentic language materials. The next theme is about unfettered flow of information. And I think if we use a range of technologies that can enable unfettered or unrestricted flow, although it can also act in the opposite direction. But the idea here was to easily share and access language materials and value different contributions. So flow of knowledge amongst the participants to support more democratic, participative, and inclusive practices. So enabling multiple means of communication according to what people have available to them or prefer, and accepting inputs from authentic daily life or informal settings, not just the formal setting. So therefore create resources found or created by learners. The fourth theme is then enjoyment and perception of personal gains. So this is a personal learning perspective, considering our learners' interests and their affective or emotional response to the tasks. Positive experiences can lead to positive attitudes, as we know, and that's a good thing in the long term. So suggested practices here are again about more learner choice in terms of goals, content, location, or learning partners, focusing also on their growth in confidence and competence, particularly relevant to language learning, through constant rehearsal and practice, and making that enjoyable for them, and valuing those personal gains alongside the formal learning outcomes that are perhaps specified by teachers and institutions. So trying to combine those two aspects. And the final theme is about breaking down barriers. What kind of barriers are we talking about? Well, multiple barriers here. It could be barriers of time and place, which are very strongly associated with mobile learning, but also bringing into the picture here, breaking down barriers of ability, access to teachers, peers, and technical support, age barriers, gender barriers, culture and contextual barriers. And here the authors in the book suggested certain practices, flexible self-paced learning to try and overcome some of these barriers. Again, the theme of combining informal and formal learning, smoothing transitions between contexts or levels, and intergenerational learning and intercultural learning. So these are important themes, and I'm particularly inspired by this last theme of breaking down barriers and trying to understand how we can work towards this what seems to me like a very sort of noble goal, really, of breaking down those barriers. And in the last couple of years, we've been lucky enough to successfully bid for funding from the British Council against two of their research agendas that they're currently pursuing, one being on widening participation and the other on the future of English. So we have a project in each of these research strands. The first one we're completing towards the end of this year, and the second one we've just started. So I shall briefly say something about those. So the one that is in widening participation is our current project. Its long title is Reaching Out to Marginalized Populations in Under-Resourced Countries. And we're looking at the roles of mobile technologies and English in these contexts. So we're working in 4 countries, as you can see here: Sudan, Senegal, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So 2 are in Africa and 2 are in Asia. What we've tried to do here is understand the literature on marginalization in education, which communities are affected, and then collecting accounts of experiences from the marginalized students, teachers, and parents in schools. So we're working with young people aged 13 to 15 in this project. And we're looking at a number of schools in each country. We are analysing the educational practices in those classes and outside of class, mediated by mobile technology, the English language, which is often the language of instruction, but not the home language. And so the relationship between English and local languages. And in the final phase of our project, towards the end of this year, we will be drawing out policy, pedagogical and research implications from our findings around the use of mainly mobile technology and the English language and local languages. So it's, I think, interesting and important work. As I said, we are concerned with understanding and potentially reducing educational marginalization through appropriate use of technology. So we're looking at the processes that make people, that put people in the position of being marginalized for different reasons, and what opportunities they may or may not have, and their inability to access or participate in education due to many reasons, of course, poverty being a major reason, but also gender in those contexts, and often being part of an ethnic minority is a big constraint for those children, and having a mother language that's different from languages used at school. So those are the contextual aspects. And then when we look at their use of technology, well, they may have access to technology in one sense, but often there are problems with connectivity, costs of ownership and use. Having to share technology is quite common. And if you have low proficiency in English or low digital skills, then these are additional barriers. So they tell us about their experiences that we're currently analyzing, saying things like they have a phone, but they rarely use it because they can't afford a data connection. They're not allowed perhaps to touch the phone at home, or they face difficulties because of connectivity. They use technology from their relatives' houses or their relatives' mobile phones. And they look for opportunities to use, free Wi-Fi because of the cost issues. So a lot of sort of contextual barriers to extensive use. I think this really just highlights the fact that when we talk about mobile learning being available to everyone now throughout the world, we really need to understand that this isn't necessarily the case for all. And so also we're looking at their experiences of technology in schools. This was, of course, during the pandemic that we were conducting this research. And really quite surprising that the teachers may have, for example, used their phones to prepare lessons, but then don't use it in the classroom, don't use the technology in the classroom. Students saying they have a lab, a computer lab that was not used during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, our teacher would take us to the lab, would demonstrate things. Now it's not happening. So I think a lot of issues there around, people being taken by surprise when the pandemic occurred and not having alternative plans in place. And so existing technology being underutilized. And finally, onto the new project that we've just started, which is called English for the EDI generation. So EDI standing for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. In this one, we're going to be looking at trends in the use of English and digital mobile technologies. This project is focusing on higher education in East and South Asia. And we're going to be looking at 3 trends in China, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. The 3 trends were specified by the British Council amongst a larger list of trends that they were encouraging researchers to explore. So as you can see there, it's about growth in online English language learning, the emphasis or not on EDI, and the use of digital technologies to enable access to English language learning. So these are some of the trends that we're looking at, as well as any that that are emergent and that we will hope to discover in this project. We will be working in these countries, again, collecting accounts of experiences from students and teachers, but also more widely this time. We're going to be more engaged with the policymakers, the NGOs or INGOs, IT companies, and education specialists, and using an ecological system theory to reflect on the regional and local ecologies of teaching, learning and assessment and use of technology. And again, drawing out some policy, pedagogical and research implications, how to address those EDI issues in detailed practices, whether already there is a growing awareness of equality, diversity and inclusion, or not. So we have some research questions for this project that you may be interested in. We're looking at perceptions of EDI in higher education, how stakeholders perceive the use of digital mobile technology, how they perceive the role and value of English in the next 10 years. Of course, we're looking at higher education in particular. What are the students and other stakeholders' conceptions around the role of English in better career or life opportunities in relation to other languages used at university, and creating an equitable and inclusive society. And the final question, number 4 here, is a particular interest in looking at how students' experience changes between using English at school and then in higher education, and how that influences their perspectives and their perceptions as well of what will be possible in the future in terms of their own opportunities. So as we've been formulating these research questions for our projects, I've also started to reflect on research questions more broadly in the field of mobile learning. What kinds of things are we researching? What are we asking? So some of you may have seen my publication last year called Reflections on Research Questions in Mobile Assisted Language Learning. And here, there are big questions for all of us, I think. What are the pressing global and local challenges that we should be addressing in terms of both formal and informal education and language learning? And what are our research agendas? Who sets those agendas for our research? Is it us? Is it someone else? Are we following someone else's agenda? That's not a bad thing, but it's something to reflect on. What types of research questions do we formulate within those research agendas? We have, as researchers, usually a certain amount of agency. We can decide what questions we pursue. And so I think we have that responsibility to reflect on it, perhaps look back on what we've been researching, say, do I want to keep pursuing those questions or some other questions? There has been a discourse in the field around agendas for mobile learning. In 2014, Mark Pegram wrote about this in his book. He identified 3 agendas: transforming teaching and learning. Unsurprisingly, of course, that's a major agenda. As part of that, there's a discourse around dismantling formal education, of course. There's a major agenda around developing what I say now used to be called 21st century skills. I don't know if we're still using that phrase. It was very popular at one stage. And the sort of discourse around setting the digital natives free, to do what they do in their free time or in their informal learning. Promoting social justice is the third agenda that he identified, and catering to special needs. So I think those agendas are still relevant. They still continue. We still align ourselves to those agendas. But things move on as well. Of course, we cannot fail to notice the advent of artificial intelligence and the huge impact that's having on education. In a way, forcing us to research this aspect, which of course is a fascinating field, but it's somewhat imposed also on our as researchers. And we need to get to grips with big questions like, what will AI do and what will people do? And in terms of the skills of the future, well, some of these are listed in this diagram: creativity, curiosity, compassion, critical thinking, or collaboration. Will AI do those things, or will people do them? And what is the role of mobile technology in all that? So we are now in an almost post-pandemic world. And in this world of post-pandemic education, which agendas are we going to follow? Are we going to be driven by the AI agenda? Are we going to be driven by maybe agendas around more equitable or compassionate teaching, learning, and assessment? There is growing awareness of inequity. There is also growing awareness of the role of well-being in education. So these may be major trends. And finally, then, just for you to reflect on what you've just heard me talk about in the past hour. So having heard about all these different trends, which are the broad trends or themes in your research? Is your research or teaching currently aligned to any of them? And are there other emerging trends in mobile learning or pedagogical innovation that you consider important, that perhaps haven't been talked about in this session? There are others, of course. The metaverse is another big upcoming innovation and trend that I haven't touched upon here. But I'm sure it will be discussed in your in your webinars. So really up to you and over to you in a way to join this discussion. My concluding thoughts are that by looking at past and future pedagogical innovations, we can detect some trends in learning. These trends might inform our research agendas. And then if we develop such research agendas, they in turn may influence the education opportunities and experiences for all our learners in the future, and hopefully a broader range of learners as we widen participation for all. So thank you very much. If you want to find out more about our program and my publications and my colleagues' publications, then you can access the ORO system there through the link. And this is the Open Research Online repository where many of the publications I've mentioned can be downloaded and read. So thank you very much for your attention today. It's been a pleasure to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Agnes. Yeah, it's a very inspiration talk, and also figure out some future direction of mobile learning. Yeah, so for myself, it's also a good opportunity for us to stay for a while and do reflections on what are the progress of learning, mobile learning, and how the changes of mobile learning, considering the changes of learning context. So now we go to the Q&A session. May I invite our audience to ask questions based on your research interests, yeah, or your current projects and research. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very interested in any questions and also any comments, because of course in your association, you've got a whole range of different projects and different themes, I suppose, that emerge from those that I in turn would be interested to know about.
Yeah, Professor Agnes, currently I have one project. Yeah, so my focus is mobile learning in science education. Yeah, for past years I use the Unquare for my project. Yeah, I collaborate with Professor Michael Schaps. Yeah, so now I'm interested in one of your themes is about smooth transition between formal learning and informal learning. Yeah. So considering the current situation, so can you give us some guide or some ideas about what kind of changes about students learning in informal context, especially home activities? Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a good question because, as I mentioned in my talk, we understand more about our learners' home environments now compared to a couple of years ago. You know, through the experience of online teaching, sometimes enforced online teaching. Nevertheless, online teaching that gives us some insights into their home environments and their setup and what possibilities they have. It encourages us to start a conversation with our learners about what they learn outside of formal education and where they do that. So I think that's a very important starting point. A lot of informal learning now takes place online. We've written about it in our reports, things like esports, for example, You know, as an example from a couple of years ago, where large numbers of people participate in online activity that's connected also to physical activity, sports, you know, both online and offline, and they're doing that from home. So it's sort of understanding some of the activities that they engage in and why, what they get out of it. You know, I think in terms of their motivations, in terms of who they learn with, the technologies that they're using, and what if anything they learn from it. I think that's such a valuable activity, just actually talking about that with learners, because we can discover a lot from it, and also we can encourage them to reflect on their informal learning and make that a habit that hopefully will last a lifetime of more kind of self-directed learning that is also reflective, that appreciates, you know, what you get out of something as opposed to just being immersed in it. And then I think out of that conversation and out of those understandings will flow connections that can be made between formal and formal and informal education. So it's probably not something that we can just sit down and do and design, but you know, it's something that is an evolving process, and I think little by little we can both introduce into informal learning some of the structures and some of the approaches from formal learning, and vice versa. You know, so I think it is going to be a two-way process that is involved here.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your answers. So just now we received one question from our participant. Yeah, so the question is about how do you see the building of student-teacher community of blended learning?
Yeah, that's a big question. I like big questions, but it's quite a complex question in a sense, because for many learners, being involved in a community with teachers might be quite a new experience, depending on, you know, what style of teaching and learning they are involved in. So that's, I think, one aspect. It's kind of there's an element of culture change here that may be being touched upon. The idea of building a community, which may not be, as I say, familiar to all, and what are the sort of the rules of that community, what are the expectations of how such a community will work, maybe need to be made explicit and understood and talked about. But certainly, increasingly, we will see those blends of online and offline learning, which is actually something we've written about in our latest report as well. So I refer you to that when it comes out later this week. There are some ideas there about combining the two. Often, online and offline learning is a way of, you know, connecting different settings. So, for example, people working at home and in an educational setting and in a work context where they're, for example, have some work experience, or it's their job that's being combined with learning. So so those communities are also about, for example, again, something that we've written in our latest report, how the teacher might be able to assess the learner at work remotely. And so the teacher then and the student and the work context are all part of a larger community of blended learning that's happening across different contexts. How do we build such communities? Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's building and then sustaining. There's always those two aspects. Finding the platform that people want to use, that they feel comfortable with, that they go to regularly without having to make a special effort, perhaps. So a convivial and familiar and an environment that they enjoy, and then how to sustain those interactions in that community. For example, giving people different roles in their community so that they they are tasked with maintaining it. And I think teachers being open to students sharing some of their traditional roles and expertise, being able to share out those roles amongst the students, and the students being open to that, not always looking to the teacher for answers, but looking to the community. So I think there are a lot of cultural changes underpinning this, and then also the technological changes that need to take place, and the new structures that should be put in place to make sure that the community doesn't fizzle out, but that it continues and thrives.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Anderson. So I think we can record what Professor Agnes talk, and I think we can also click the link just now Professor Agnes shared with us. We can click the link, read her research papers. Yeah, it is really inspiring papers and good papers, which I also refer in my research work. Yeah, so you are also welcome to share Professor Agnes' research and talk with your colleagues. Yeah, so I think more potentials of mobile learning in the future research areas of our educational technologies and learning sciences. Okay, yeah. So if you have no more questions, we will end this webinar. So this is our next webinar's talk. Okay, so yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Agnes. Yeah, so
wish you all the best for the rest of your webinar.
Thank you. So thank you for your attending. So this is so please scan this QR code for give us feedback on how to improve our webinar. Okay. Yeah. So. So yeah. So for the participants, can you stay for a while and scan the QR code to give us some feedback? Okay, thank you. Okay. So thank you for attending the webinar. Okay, bye-bye.